Okay, hi Chris.
Hi, Tom.
So, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Manning is a distinguished computer scientist. He's particularly influential and is involved, I think, in inventing NLP as we know it. He's highly influential in machine learning. He is director of the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. And Chris, we are very pleased that you could join us today. Now, everybody, the world is all about LLMs, awash in LLMs, and everybody's thinking about LLMs. Perhaps you could share with us, where did these things come from? How did they happen, and what do they really do?
Sure, yeah. So if I do the history first, in some sense, LLMs have existed for a very, very long time, at least 40 years. So they started off as just word-in-context prediction machines. So probably the first place that many people saw LLMs was in spelling correction. So I think it was in 1997 that Microsoft Word added contextual spelling correction, that before it just used to sort of say, here are a list of words that you might have meant to type instead because we didn't find in the dictionary. And then it changed so that it actually knew something about the context. And so it could tell you whether you should be writing T-H-E-R-E or T-H-E-I-R. And that was already a primitive language model. And the same kind of language models were being used for speech recognition and machine translation. But none of that stuff worked very well in those days. So where did they really come from? So starting with the neural network or deep learning revolution that built in the 2010s, that people started to build with those better representations of language inside neural networks. And so it was really around 2017, 2018 that emerged this idea that if we could just train models on large amounts of text, then we'd actually get some pretty profound abilities. And so then it's been expanding out over the last 5 years since then. Yeah, I guess I better say something about what they are. Yeah, I think I have to give two answers to what a large language model is. And I think this is the source of a lot of confusion for people. So, on one level, a large language model, you pour a huge amount of text into it, actually over 1 trillion words in the largest current models. From that, a very large neural network, which ultimately is sort of like hundreds of billions or something of numbers, are learnt that represent all the patterns of sequences of words in that text. And then based on all those numbers it's learnt, it's trying to, given any piece of text, predict likely next words. So that makes it sound like, that's a very mechanistic explanation. It's true, but it makes it sound like not much of anything. It just sounds like it's still a predict the next word system like you would use for the contextual spelling correction, only a bit better now. But I think that just fails to capture what's actually happened. That it turns out that when you do this on a massive scale, when you've got a massive neural network that can capture everything in text it reads, it starts to become useful for that neural network to predict better, to actually understand the world, to understand language. So there are lots of easy examples of this, right? So if the text is saying the French president and it's trying to predict which words come next, well, it really helps if you know the name of the French president, and so you can put in Macron there. But then once the model gets even bigger, it starts to learn that if the piece of text had been saying, in the 1980s, the French president, and then you've got to predict a different name, maybe Mitterrand. I might be wrong on the dates there, right? So it has to learn all about the world. And so the end result of this is that we have a box in these LLMs where we can give it instructions, we can give it questions, and it understands human language pretty much as well as a human being and can do what we want. And so when you think of it that way, you've got a language understanding box, this wonderful new capability, and it doesn't really feel like it's just doing text prediction at all.
So when there's this concept that I think is important, I understand is important to LLMs, called an embedding. Can you tell us what an embedding is, and what does an embedding mean?
An embedding is a big list of real numbers. Yeah, so this is, in some sense, it's kind of very strange and weird the way this technology has gone. So for nearly all of the history of artificial intelligence, a lot of it was about symbols. So if you had a word like truth, it was a symbol, a concept. But in the neural network world, symbols are being turned into lists of real numbers. And so both for a single word, but also for a paragraph or a whole document, we're making embeddings of it. Big, long lists of real numbers that might be 2,000 long or something like that. And these lists of real numbers represent the meanings of words, the meanings of paragraphs. And they have huge advantages in allowing easy similarity calculations so that you can see what things are similar, and you can also see the different parts of things being separated out in parts of that list. That might sound really, really weird and unnatural, but you should also remember what your brains are like, right? That your brains are all of these neurons, which are sort of different ones are firing at different rates depending on signals coming in. They're also this sort of weirdly distributed continuous space.
So now this list of numbers in this embedding, this has something to do with this numerical representation kind of represents from the corpus of information that this large language model was able to explore, kind of what the probabilities are of the next word, right? So the quick brown fox, I think the highest probability of the next word might be jumped, and something less higher than that might be ran, and something less higher than that might be died. And somehow we're looking at all the words that are going to follow that phrase, the quick brown fox, and that list is the embedding, right? But there's this thing called temperature. So tell us about temperature, because if the temperature is set to 0, it's always going to go to jumped, right? It's going to go to the highest probable word. But if the temperature is set to 0, I understand you get very boring prose.
Yeah, right.
But if you set the temperature to non-zero and let this thing go to less probable next words, the prose gets more interesting and more human-like. Is any of this true?
Yeah. So the models are giving probabilities of next words. And so one thing you can do is just always choose the highest probability next word. And you can do that, and in some circumstances it's the right thing to do. Like if you're translating a piece of text, you might just want the most probable translation. But a lot of the time, when we're exploring ideas or wanting to write more creative prose, we'd like some unexpected things, some things that are plausible, that fit with the context, but aren't the first thing that would come into your head. And so to achieve that, there's a knob, the temperature knob that you can turn, which will cause the large language model to pick more evenly out of different things that have some probability but aren't the most probable. And so that gives you kind of, I think Bing calls it creative mode when you're turning up the temperature, and so that you're seeing different kinds of ideas. And so the kind of place that's useful to sort of put in a business context for a moment is, one of the things that large language models have been found to be really useful for is brainstorming. So there are a number of studies out now that have found that, rather than getting, your 8 human beings in a room and say, let's think up some good ideas, for new product directions or marketing slogans, you can actually do better by just sitting down with your large language model and saying, hey, give me some ideas. And well, if you want to do that, you want to sample lots of different ideas. The value in the device is sort of seeing the whole space more effectively. And so that's when you want to have this creativity.
And so as you see this thing kind of playing out in the next few years in the development of large language models, where do you see it going?
So I think it's...
And by the way, what do you think they can do now? I mean, what do they do now that's useful? And then where do you think it's going?
Right. I think they can do a ton now that's useful. I mean, you know, I won't do a survey now of different people and their use of large language models, but I think at the moment, the power of what you can do with large language models and other forms of generative AI is still just enormously underappreciated. That, you know, change is hard, it takes time. There are certainly lots of people in different companies that are starting to, you know, find boring tasks that they don't like and are finding that they can get a large language model to do them mainly for them. So if you have to write weekly reports and stuff like that, try it out with your large language model, write 3 bullet points and it'll turn it into a 3-paragraph email for you. But, you know, overall, I think, you know, people just underappreciate it. There's still lots of tasks that we're doing by hand where we could now be using large language models effectively. So if you need to get information out of long documents, you can use a large language model. If you need to be preparing stuff for marketing comms, you know, I've now done a couple of times with different companies saying I can use a large language model to improve your marketing messages and just sort of taken what their current marketing messages are and say, large language model, can you improve these and explain why what you're doing is better? Got improved versions that people at the company have agreed is better than what their own comms people have produced, right? So there are all of these places where we could be making more use of large language models, and a bunch of them were mentioned in the previous session as well. And I think most companies are sort of still very early in that process.
Do you see this? I mean, does this have legs? Does this go for a while, this development of large language models, or is it transcended by something new? Does a new idea replace it?
I think this has legs. So, you know, if short term is sort of meaning 3 to 5 years, I think it's just completely clear what the trajectory is, that large language models are still going to get enormously better. So, you know, if you look around the media at the moment, you can both see amazing things that an LLM can do and funny ways that they've made terrible goofs. And I think the important thing to remember is that these are the worst LLMs you'll ever see. The ones that are coming out, you know, new one came out earlier this week from Anthropic, Claude 3, which people are saying amazing things about. And, you know, there'll be ones next year and the year after, and they will continue to get much, much better at language understanding and production above a base that's actually already quite good. But it's not only about language models. So there are all kinds of types of data, which was again being talked about earlier as well. At Stanford, we've liked the term foundation models as a name that tries to encompass that the basic idea of these distributed neural networks trained on huge amounts of data can be applied to any kind of data. So you can apply it to images, you can apply it to videos, you can apply it to speech, but you can even apply it to things like telemetry and sensor data that any of these you can collect large amounts of data, you can build a large neural foundation model out of it, and that can give you a lot of power. And I think we're going to start to see that convergence where we have models that work across a lot of kinds of data. We're already starting to see it, so some of the recent so-called large language models will also, you know, take in or produce outwards images, pictures, and I think we're going to see tons more of that.
You know, one of the terms, Art, that you just touched upon, that we're hearing with increasing frequency, particularly in places like if you read the current draft of the EU AI Act, or the presidential document that he wrote on AI. I forget what it was, about a month ago. I forget what the exact title of it is. But there's this concept that is being very frequently used, and it has an ominous connotation to it just when you get to the rest of the sentence, okay, the rest of the paragraph, and that is dual-use foundational model. What does that mean? Why is it important? And why is everybody spooked?
Okay. So first on the foundation model, I mean, there are multiple terms around, if I'm honest, the one that's most winning at the moment is generative AI. I'll admit that.
So that would be, that's an example of a foundational model.
It's an example of a foundation model.
And is it dual use?
Yes, it can be dual use as well. So just quickly on foundation models. So generative AI is sort of where the AI generates things. It might generate text, or it might generate images, or it might generate videos. I mean, but there are lots of ways that we want to use the same technology, not only for generation, but also analysis. So you want it to sort of analyze the images that your plane is capturing. And so, the appeal of the word foundation model is it can spread over both the generative uses and the analytic uses. But regardless of whether we're talking about generative AI or the wider class of foundation models, these are powerful technologies which can be used for all kinds of bad purposes as well as good purposes. So, one of the bad purposes that we've already started to see with the upcoming US election, and I'm sure we'll see many more instances of before the election is over, is that it's now very easy to do voice cloning. It's easy to do image cloning. It's getting more possible to even make Gen AI videos. So we're going to see tons of fake stuff. And there's already been a bunch, right? There's the sort of the Biden voice clone that was being played to prospective voters in New England. There are fake pictures of Donald Trump embracing people, and there's going to be a lot more of this. Now, of course, fake photos have existed ever since the Soviet Union in the 1950s, but, it's changed because it's now something that just about anybody can produce very convincingly ones very easily, as opposed to it taking sort of days to try and doctor an old photograph.
So, a lot of the discussion when we get into AI and now generative AI is with, Elon and others who are portraying this, horribly dystopian future when these large language models get out of their box and, get out of the smart refrigerator and take over our house, okay? And we have we break into this area of sentient computing where, as in, Space Odyssey, the navigation system takes over the spacecraft. So how do you see this? I mean, where do you see the, what are your thoughts on sentient computing? If it happens, when does it happen? How concerned do we need to be about sentient computing and this malevolent language model that portends this Orwellian future?
Yeah, not very. So I think there's a lot of sort of sci-fi inspired fantasy that we're seeing at the moment, and lots of predictions of, AI takeoff and exponential improvement, and that, these superhuman AIs will be taking over. Some people have predicted they'll be taking over by 2030. So if that's true, we'd really start to be pretty worried about that. I actually don't think that's true. I think it's not true on a number of dimensions. I mean, firstly, the claim that, we've seen this rapid increase in capabilities, therefore we're on this exponential and it's just going to get steeper, and therefore we'll have, the artificial superintelligence in 2030, I think there's no reason to believe that. If you look at the history of technologies, technology has generally improved by fits and starts, right? You know that people had big inventions, right? Once upon a time, you know, steam power for steam-powered looms and trains was a huge invention, which greatly improved a lot of production. Then there were other huge technology unlocks, electricity, the internet. But, you know, most of these technology unlocks, there's a big new improvement, and then it slows down again, right? That's like what's happened with cell phones, right? You know, once upon a time, you know, it was dramatic that there were cell phones, and they got amazingly better each year. But, you know, now they've changed this state that they barely seem to change from one year to the next, and about the most you can advertise is that the camera is better, right? I think the same thing will happen with these large language models, right? They are an enormously productive technology unlock because they provide this mechanism where you could slurp up so much of the creation of human intelligence into this huge neural model and exploit all of that gathered human intelligence for writing text or producing images. But, you know, I'm not saying it's the last thing we'll ever work out how to do, but I think things will slow down again because it'll take time for people to work out some of the harder problems of reasoning, learning, memory that underlie the sort of richer parts of human intelligence. But, you know, the other thing I just want to say is, you know, I think of a lot of these, you know, talks about AI taking over the world. Well, they're a sort of alpha male fantasy. Now, I probably should be careful because there are probably a few alpha males in the audience here. But, you know, there's sort of this natural human desire to have power and be in charge, right? That's an evolutionary thing. And the kind of people who have the most influence in the media, such as Elon Musk, clearly have this attribute. And so they project it onto AI systems. But, you know, there's absolutely no reason to think that an AI system will have that urge. You know, current AI systems, you know, whatever kinds of thinking they can do, they don't have any urges, right? They're not sentient in the sense that they feel things. There's no sentience there at all. So I think there's an enormous amount of projection and an enormous lack of reality in a lot of these predictions.
Now, you know, many students of yours and employees of mine, okay, who have studied under you and others and studied, you know, reinforcement learning and these TD systems and neural networks, they believe that these concepts are absolutely mimic the way the human mind works, okay? Now, clearly they're useful, but are they useful or do they really mimic the way the human mind works?
They're useful and they pick up on a few properties of the human mind, but they're nothing like mimicking the human mind. I mean, you know, yeah, so the sort of artificial neural networks that we now use in all of these Gen AI models, right? They are inspired by human neurons because human neurons also have, you know, inputs that come in that are weighted with real numbers, and then based on how much the neuron is excited, it starts firing at some rate, which is sort of a real number as well. So, you know, that was the inspiration for these neural networks. And by mimicking some aspects of the human mind, the kind of distributed computation, well, it's delivered for us a much more powerful new form of artificial intelligence. But, you know, human minds have a lot of complexity and a lot of organization, none of which are in these neural networks, particular you know, capacities for long-term memories being built is one of the areas that, you know, we're not doing at all with these current models where we train them once at the beginning. They're not sort of learning through life the same way. And, you know, in truth, neuroscience is still really in its early days. We have very little idea how human brains work. I mean, the truth is, there are these worms, right? Nematode worms that are studied and have a brain of 130 neurons, right? Scientists still can't explain how nematode worms manage to learn when they go around and sense different things in their environment. So, we're not really in a position to mimic the brains because we still don't understand how they work, and in particular some of their amazing learning capabilities, neural networks are still far, far inferior.
So, the last time that you and I crossed paths was and I never go to AI conferences, but I did go to one because you were there. And there's some discussion of the human brain that I think is order of 100 billion neurons, 100 trillion connections, and all of those connections are analog, with neurotransmitters and neuromodulators, of which there are, order of 100, okay, in different concentrations. So this is it operates on what? I think you said 12 watts, okay?
17.
Oh, 17 watts, okay, I stand corrected. Okay, and so, how does that compare to what we can do with these systems that we use to train these learning models?
Yeah, so 100 billion is the number of our neurons, and that, that's probably a number that's maybe familiar from some of the parameter counts that you see for neural networks. But the parameters of a neural network, the real numbers, they're really much more equivalent to the number of synapses, the number of sort of connections between one neuron and another. And so the number of synaptic connections, it's actually not precisely known. So that's, again, we have a lot still to discover about neuroscience, but the estimates are that it's north of 100 trillion. So somewhere between 100 trillion and a quadrillion. And so that number is still at least 100 times larger than the largest neural networks that we've made today. So, brains are still a lot bigger, as well as having apparently much better capabilities of learning from data. So there's still some catching up to do. But, on the other hand, the sobering part is we're actually getting kind of close, right? If we go back a few years, in 2018, Google bought out the BERT model. I'm not sure if some of you heard about that at the time. It was the first neural network that they put into improving their search results. And the BERT model was only, 300 million neurons, and now people are building models with 300 billion neurons. So that's sort of 6 years, and we've gone up 3 orders of magnitude, 1,000-fold. And so if we only have 2 more orders of magnitude to go to get something about the size of a human brain, we're actually starting to get artificial networks that are near parity. But I think there are other more important ways in which we are lacking still. So one of them is power use. If you pay the electricity bills, you doubtless know that these GPUs that everyone uses for neural networks suck up a lot of power, right? So one H100 uses something like 700 watts. So that's a lot of power compared to your brain running on 17 watts. So there's some work to do there. But also, fundamental learning capabilities and reasoning capabilities are still far superior in human brains.
Now, one of the areas that I'm certain you touch on at Stanford with Fei and John Etcheverry and this organization that you're involved in with kind of HAI. Remind me what it stands for. I know I'm involved.
The Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence Institute.
Yeah. Okay. Now, there's lots of discussion, and this is broader than AI because I think it's difficult when we deal with an algorithm to decide when an algorithm becomes AI. I'm not sure where that line is, and maybe you do, but
unclear.
Certain nobody in Congress does. I'm confident of that. Now there's lots of discussion with the EU AI Act and in Washington D.C. about the need to protect ourselves from these algorithms and to make sure that these algorithms are inspected for safety before somebody can publish an algorithm. What are your thoughts on that discussion?
Yeah, so I think we should be realistic about the fact that there are risks and dangers, but on the other hand, I think we should be optimistic as to how much can be done with these AI developments. I mean, in that sense, AI is no different from electricity, right? When electricity first started to be deployed across the United States, quite a few people died from electricity, right? Because there's lots of ways in which it can be dangerous. Early versions of electrical systems, the old knob and tube wiring and things like that, tried to make some early attempts at providing safety. But people didn't have the kind of safety standards that we have today to make electricity reasonably safe, and whole bunches of people died. There was also a lack of understanding by people, so a lot of people just weren't aware of where the dangers were. And I think in truth it's going to be the same with AI, that there are clear ways in which bad scenarios can happen. One of the ways that bad scenarios can happen that I think we're going to be seeing increasingly rolling out in the next couple of years is you can make AI much more powerful again by connecting it up to tools and systems. So rather than just AI being this wonderful, I'll ask it questions in human language and it'll do the wonderful things you saw in the previous session, the next step you can take is say, well, why don't I just hook that AI up to my company's systems, and then I can give instructions like, can you turn off this power plant at this time and do something else over here, and it'll start taking actions and doing stuff. And well, there might be roles for that used judiciously, but there are very clear ways in which that can go wrong. And I'm sure that we're going to see some, big disasters happen. So I think we need to be thinking with a lot of care about how these systems are deployed, what powers they're given, what kind of human checks are needed, and also how we're going to work with this technology across society. So, some of this connects to sort of general issues of the collection and use of data across society, right? So in the US, there's not really much in the way of data privacy legislation. The state of Illinois has some, actually. It's one of the places that's passed it. But, by and large, these days, all of our personal private information is being collected up by all sorts of companies, and a lot of it is being traded on the gray market by various kinds of data brokers without much of our awareness. I don't actually think that's such a good thing. I think individuals should have more control over their data. So all of that is then likely to get fed into generative AI systems at some point, and then there are all the risks of data leakage and data misuse and things like that. There were traditional standards, right? The traditional standards were that you can't use things like age and race and gender as a basis for discrimination. The problem is that those traditional safeguards are becoming outmoded by AI because, even if you say AI system, don't use these 3 predictors, if you have in the system, 20 other predictors, it knows about what hair care products you've bought recently, it knows about, what exercises you do at the gym, well, it can just reconstruct your age, gender, ethnicity from other proxy variables with almost 100% accuracy. And so that's how we have to work out how we're going to sort of have AI systems work in human society in ways that we want rather than ways that we don't want.
Fascinating. One final question. Chris, if my memory serves me correct, one of the research topics for which one of the many research topics for which you're particularly renowned was, NLP and I think Stanford Core NLP. So what was that about, and was that a precursor to these language models that we're dealing with today?
I mean, yeah, so Stanford Core NLP was an open source NLP product, a system that we built at the beginning of the 2010s. I mean, I think it wasn't honestly really a precursor. It was sort of more the last decade system. So in the 2010s, there was the new revolution then was probabilistic NLP systems, where it was using a lot of data and a lot of probabilities to be able to predict things about next words or sentence structures or what was the name of a company or a person. But it was still doing it with symbols. And so in that decade, sort of Stanford Core NLP was pretty much the best NLP system that was out there. And lots of companies, the US government, lots of places use Stanford Core NLP for their NLP. I think it's fair to say now that you shouldn't be doing that anymore, and it's been basically superseded by neural NLP approaches. And all the same tasks can be done better by it. I guess in the later 2010s, my group then started working on things like word vectors, glove embeddings, building what were then the large language models, little large language models like Electra and so on, and it's more, and neural machine translation, it's more some of those developments that then led into the bigger efforts that are being done by Google, OpenAI, et cetera today.
Fascinating. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Dr. Manning for his thoughts and his insights. Chris?